Stephen Leith, Scott Stanley,
Here.
and Stephen Willard.
Here.
And I believe Stephen Leith may have just joined. Stephen, we were just doing a roll call. I'll turn it over to you, Steve Willard.
Okay, thank you very much, Veronica. As you know, our NSBO liaisons are Ann Bushmiller, Portia Flowers, and Alexandra Serchel. Our executive secretaries are Drew Ayers and Veronica Shelley. Moving to our agenda, today's meeting is an open session and will primarily focus on NSF's established program to stimulate competitive research, more commonly referred to as EPSCoR. We have two invited speakers today. First of all, we have Jose Fuentes, Chairman of the Committee on Equal Opportunity in Science and Engineering, what we call CEOS, and co-chair of its subcommittee on the future of EPSCoR, who will give us a briefing on the future of EPSCoR report. Then we will hear from EPSCoR section head, Sandra Richardson, who will tell us about agency responses to the futures of EPSCoR and other EPSCoR related reports and legislation. Time has been allocated for discussion and possible question. Before turning the floor over to Jose, I wanted to give a brief update on the agency's response to the Sexual Assault and Harassment Prevention and Response, known by its acronym SAPPER. Now, this is with regard to Antarctica. 2 town hall meetings will be held at the end of the month on the ice with a subset of board members in attendance. These meetings will not be open to the public, but they evidence our continuing commitment to really address these issues, get understanding, and get significant improvements in the situation down there on the ice. We now turn to a discussion of EPSCoR. The committee looks forward to hearing more about the goals of the EPSCoR program. The statutory objective of the program is helping eligible states develop the research infrastructure that will make them more competitive for federal research funding. This is accomplished by providing strategies for and collecting data on the success of grant funding competition. This topic is important and timely because the CHIPS and Science Act calls for NSF to increase its EPSCoR investment in the coming years, with the recently enacted budget calling for an additional $245 million to be invested in EPSCoR jurisdictions. Recently, several reports have been issued on policy, operational, and fiscal aspects of NSF's EPSCoR program. You may remember OIG briefings to the Committee on Oversight in 2021 and 2022 on its audit and capstone report on EPSCoR. Last year, CEOS released its report on the future of EPSCoR. GAO released its report calling for improved reporting to Congress, and OIA's Evaluation and Assessment Capability Division released an NSF Commission study on EPSCoR as a mechanism for building research competitiveness. In addition, NSF submitted a required annual report to Congress for fiscal year 2021, describing its EPSCoR strategy and objectives, awards made, and program outcomes. As a reminder, you can find all of these materials in tabs 1.2 and beyond in your board book. It is our hope that today's meeting will give the committee an opportunity to hear from NSF how they have assessed the program's current status and how they are responding to report findings, recommendations, and legislative mandates. I'll now turn the floor over to Jose Fuentes, Chairman of CEOS and co-chair of CEOS's Committee on the Future of EPSCoR. Jose.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, from the Pennsylvania State University, where I am a faculty member in the area of climate science. I thank all of you for the opportunity to discuss the recent work of CEOS Subcommittee on the Future of EPSCoR. In the next few minutes, I will give you a brief description of what CEOS is, and also I will describe the work of the subcommittee. Perhaps if we can have these slides so that we can use the slides to guide the ideas that I'm going to be presenting. Are the slides ready? Possibly not. I think some slides should be ready somewhere. Okay. Well, if not, let me just start by indicating that CEOS was established through the Science and Engineering Equal Opportunities Act of 1980 to advise the foundation on policies and programs to encourage the full participation of women, persons with disabilities, and racial ethnic groups underrepresented in science and engineering. Next slide. The committee meets 3 times a year in winter, spring, and fall. In addition to demographic diversity, members come from diverse STEM fields, drawn from diverse institutions and organizations throughout the country. Members are assigned or are encouraged to participate as CEOS liaisons in NSF advisory committees. One of the key highlights that CEOS produces is a biannual report that we prepare and submit to the NSF director. And then the NSF director sends the report to Congress. In that report, CEOS makes very specific recommendations, or at times a single recommendation on how the foundation can improve broadening participation in the STEM workforce. I know that the members of the National Science Board have been working in this space, and we have been actually collaborating in that space. At times, CEOS can form subcommittees. Next slide. And in fact, in May 2021, NSF issued a Dear Colleague letter that called for envisioning the future of the NSF EPSCoR program. In response to this Dear Colleague letter, CEOS charged a subcommittee to conduct the envisioning activity. This subcommittee basically was reviewing materials provided by the NSF EPSCoR staff, also written comments or input from the community were analyzed, and we conducted several listening sessions with key stakeholders. And then at the end of that process, we synthesized all the input, and the committee deliberated so that we could develop a summary reports. And in fact, we tabled this report way back in August 2022. 4 working groups were established. These groups basically examined the research and infrastructure capacity and competitiveness. We also discussed education and workforce development and broadening participation, which is a key topic that CEOS likes to work on. And then finally, we work on the economic development. The recommendations that were included in the reports and the full reports, where we also tabulate all the key activities that we pursued, are available on both the EPSCoR webpage as well as the CEOS webpage. Next slide. The subcommittee basically was organized around 2 major motivating questions. The first one was, what does the available evidence tell us about the effectiveness of NSF EPSCoR current strategies, both individually and collectively, in advancing scalable jurisdiction-wide practices to achieve the program's goal? And the second question was, based on the answers from the first question, are there novel strategies or changes so that that we could enable the NSF program and its jurisdictional partners to more achieve a more effective mission? And so, next slide. The reports basically includes 8 recommendations, and those recommendations range from ecosystem approaches to investments, increased integration of the NSF program, and diverse talent recruitment and retention, physical and administrative infrastructure, and programs to promote intra and interjurisdictional research, education, and workforce development. And also, we recommended to support workforce, including those with diverse career pathways. And we also recommended to have more proactive inclusion strategies and access opportunities. The full CEOS membership agreed with the key takeaway message that EPSCoR jurisdictions can serve as a lever of American innovation, and therefore further expand research and development if adequately scaled, resourced, and coupled with capacity building programs that promote longer-term research success at every level. Common across these recommendations are expanding and supporting human capital, bridging, building, and strengthening resources and infrastructure with inclusion and diversity, undergirding these main areas. CEOS, in its forthcoming 2023 to 2024 biennial report, looks forward to learning what the Foundation is going to actually do in response of the recommendations. And so with these brief remarks, I will welcome any questions or comments you may have, but probably we will have to wait until Sandra can share her ideas as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Just briefly on that slide, you say increased integration of NSF EPSCoR with whom?
This is across the foundation. You probably know that the foundation sometimes works along the lines of given directorates, and we want to really ensure that the EPSCoR activities actually permeates throughout all the directorates. In addition, all the activities that NSF pursues, ranging from identifying panel members to selecting reviewers of proposals. So the subcommittee rather, recommended that probably we need to enhance that integration so that the colleagues from EPSCoR jurisdictions can partake in those activities.
Thank you.
Perhaps Sandra can elaborate on what I just said.
Sure. Let me turn the floor over to EPSCoR Section Head Sandra Richardson. Sandra?
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Steve. And good morning, everyone. And I'll just take a moment here and share slides. Julia, I see your hand raised. Do you want to interject before I get started, or is that a hand for after?
Well, I was going to ask Jose about any suggestions that CEOS had about measuring the impact of EPSCoR and any changes, and measuring the impact of any changes in the EPSCoR program. So you can have that in the back of your mind, because that's going to be a general question.
Let me just say that we discussed that topic, and we in fact have developed a recommendation to the National Science Foundation. I think once or two CEOS reports ago, we actually provided the recommendation as to how NSF can actually document progress with the programs that it supports. And of course, the EPSCoR program is a key activity that the foundation does. And so there are some recommendations that can be followed, but we did discuss that idea. Thank you for asking that question. And probably Sandra will expand on that.
Okay, I can get started.
Sandra, can I have a couple of things just that I want to. Jose, thanks very much for that report. I read through it in our diligent book, and there's a lot of information there, yeah, which you didn't cover. And I'm going to wait until Sandra's response, because it's unclear to me who wrote that report. Would that come out of NSF or out of CEOS?
Out of CEOS, as mentioned in the brief remarks I made. So okay. CEOS established a subcommittee. That committee was comprised of certain CEOS members, but also we reach out to the community, and we had colleagues who are actually part of the EPSCoR program. We went to reach out to EPSCoR jurisdictions, and we actually recruited leaders from those communities to help us think about what the future of the EPSCoR program can be. So we were really inclusive, and I think in the report you will find the names and the affiliations of all the subcommittee members. So you will...
Thank you. No, my question really comes because of the impact of AREC, A-R-E-C. And Sandra, are you going to talk about that in your presentation?
I don't have any comments on that, but happy to come back to it.
Yeah, because I would urge the committee to look at that report, because the AREC engagement is useful. And there's a lot more information that's in that than Jose showed here.
Yeah.
I'm glad they've done this forward looking, because there are a lot of implications that are more than just funding. And it's more than just, getting it abroad. There are a lot of things that have to happen. And in order for EPSCoR to really fully reach the potential that I had expected, or we have expected out of the NSB, and it includes more cross-disciplinary research, more research in cooperation with non-EPSCoR jurisdictions, a whole bunch of stuff. And so the recommendations, if implemented by NSF, could be changing. But if you've not read that stuff in diligent, I would urge you to do so, because there's a lot of good things there that imply how we might change EPSCoR, but there's some of these are dramatic changes and suggestions. And I'm really curious if NSF is prepared to accept some of those recommendations. So Sandra, I look forward to your response, and so it gives me a sense of whether or not EPSCoR really can be changed, because it's not doing its job as some of us see it, as how it should be done, how it could be done. And it can't be done just by NSF alone. That's pretty clear out of the AREC recommendations. So I'd like to hear Sandra's, but I've got questions about whether or not all the changes recommended can be implemented.
You will be happy to learn that both NSF colleagues and members of the subcommittee have been engaged in this dissemination of the reports. We have covered many venues, and I can report to you that the recommendations have been, by and large, very welcome by the community. Community meaning colleagues from EPSCoR jurisdictions, as well as community members from outside the EPSCoR jurisdictions. So we can talk some more about that if you like later.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, certainly we can revisit any of this. And Roger, to your point, the AREC model came out of our 2M study. I have a little comment around that, but certainly we're using that framework coupled with the Future of EPSCoR report to frame future directions. I'll say a little bit about it, but we can talk more broadly about it when the time comes. So I'll go ahead and get started so we can get to the interesting conversation that I know will follow. And so as mentioned, good morning again. I'm Sandra Richardson. I'm head of EPSCoR here at NSF, which is housed in our Office of Integrative Activities led by Alicia Needler, who's also on the line. Thank you again for the opportunity to join your meeting today to speak with you about EPSCoR. As you can just tell from the early conversation, this is a really exciting time for the EPSCoR program, for our EPSCoR jurisdictions, and for NSF really more broadly, as we really focus on some strategic approaches for engaging geographic diversity, in our NSF funding opportunities. So in my brief presentation today, while I know that you already have an in-depth understanding of EPSCoR, I wanted to dig a little deeper and really provide somewhat of a high-level overview of the program, with an intention really for this introduction to serve as a bridge for the rest of the presentation that will highlight some of our programmatic outcomes, some relevant reports that we've already referenced, and NSF's response to these reports, which all parallel very nicely with provisions in the recently legislated CHIPS and Science Act. So I'll get started by just highlighting and reinforcing that EPSCoR is one of the programs in NSF's cross-cutting program portfolio. And so by default, the program touches all aspects of science and education research here at NSF. Specifically, of course, our mission is to enhance research competitiveness of targeted states and territories that we call jurisdictions by strengthening these jurisdictions' STEM capacity and capability. And so as you can see here on this map on the screen, EPSCoR catalyzes research capability across 28 jurisdictions, which includes 25 states and the 3 territories of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. And this is really important to show this map just to contextualize the differences among jurisdictions. So issues that we see in Guam, for example, look very different than those in Alabama. You can also see the eligibility criteria here on this slide. But I'll also note that because there are multiple avenues for building research competitiveness, EPSCoR's work does not operate in a vacuum. And we see the 5 program goals that you see here listed on the screen as really being interconnected mechanisms to carry out our overall mission of enhancing research competitiveness of our targeted jurisdictions. So in order to build that research capacity in jurisdictions, it's important to note that EPSCoR also supports human development and education development, workforce development, broadening participation, economic development, and tech transfer, just to name a few, all highlighted in our goals. In terms of EPSCoR's reach, as noted earlier, we engage all of NSF and we cut across all of the directorates. The program is one of over 100 programs in our broadening participation portfolio at NSF. And of course, we have a distinguishing feature being that EPSCoR's mission is to broaden and strengthen geographic participation. The program has actually had tremendous impact in our jurisdiction's engagement in STEM at both the national and global level. And so this slide provides a snapshot of some of those tangible impacts on people resulting from EPSCoR's capacity building investments in students and faculty, which subsequently lead to the research productivity in jurisdictions. And I'll just continue with sharing a bit more data in terms of the importance of engaging EPSCoR jurisdictions in funding that really extends beyond just the EPSCoR program at NSF. So as you can see on this slide here, data shows that almost 20% of the US population resides in EPSCoR jurisdictions. Nearly a quarter of our accredited institutions are in jurisdictions, a quarter almost of our emerging research institutions, and 30% of our minority serving institutions, which include half of the nation's HBCUs and almost 70% of our tribal colleges. Furthermore, EPSCoR jurisdictions have substantive populations of individuals traditionally underrepresented in STEM, as shown in the data on the last row here of this matrix. So in consideration of all of these data, it's really imperative to involve all of these populations, institutions, individuals, jurisdictions in NSF funding opportunities, not just within our program, but of course throughout NSF. And that's the way that we are moving forward as a program. So on this slide here, I do want to share a bit about EPSCoR's evolution. I'm not going to go into great depth, but I do want to highlight a few things that are really important to consider in the context of the conversation. So as you know, EPSCoR is a congressionally mandated program that's been around for 44 years now. But since that time, the program has had several legislative additions and key milestones, including the additions of multiple tracks in response to legislations and reports and different investment strategies like our co-funding mechanism. We also have received several inputs from past studies, from reports, from legislation. This includes STIPI report, a National Academies report, several EPSCoR visioning activities, including the recent Future of EPSCoR report. And because of our positioning for impact, we also have had reports from GAO and OIG. We've had external evaluations, and of course, recently, CHIPS in Science. And so we are using all of these key findings that have really some overlap, informing and shaping the future of the program. Also, in shaping EPSCoR's future, we recognize a synchronized alignment of Vision 2030, of our NSF priorities, and again, EPSCoR's goals. And these are all serving as launching points for action for OIA and for EPSCoR as we look at the alignment in these particular areas to chart EPSCoR's path forward with our NSF leadership, with leadership in the EPSCoR community, and within our jurisdictions. Impact for EPSCoR really is extended across 3 of our investment strategies. Our largest strategy is the research infrastructure improvement investment strategy that supports our physical, human, and cyber infrastructure development. And so this is the strategy that's used to fund awards in response to our 3 programmatic tracks, which are in fact multi-institutional, multidisciplinary, and sometimes interjurisdictional. Also, through our co-funding mechanism, we're able to support NSF directorates in funding EPSCoR PIs who submit meritorious proposals to NSF. And we see this as a means to accelerate and support the movement of these researchers and institutions into the mainstream of NSF support. And then lastly, our outreach activities and workshop investment strategies brings EPSCoR jurisdictions together with others in both the external community and our NSF program staff across the agency to explore opportunities in a host of different emerging areas. Fiscal year 23 enacting funding distribution across our investment strategies is currently under development, but the 23 appropriation provides $245 million for the EPSCoR program, which is an increase from the 22 enacted level. We expect that any increase in EPSCoR funds will allow us the flexibility to extend our impact within these 3 investment strategies with pilot activities, partnerships with the directorates, and enhanced support for academic infrastructure needs in our EPSCoR jurisdictions. There were 3 relevant EPSCoR reports issued in 2022. I'm not going to go into much detail now on any of these reports, but happy to come back to them during our question and answer session. Jose certainly just provided a high-level overview of the Future of EPSCoR report. The other 2 reports are the 2M study that Roger mentioned, the ERIC framework coming from a bit ago. And so NSF actually commissioned the 2M study to develop a framework for understanding the variabilities within our EPSCoR jurisdictions and opportunities for EPSCoR program enhancement based on the interplay of research capacity and excellence across all levels of the jurisdictional ecosystem. So the individual researcher, the institution, and then the jurisdiction as a whole when we talk about the ecosystem. Yeah. And then, of course, we have the GAO report that was commissioned by Congress that really resulted in 1 recommendation for NSF to enhance our annual report to Congress. And then, of course, the recent CHIPS and Science Act that certainly has some provisions relevant to EPSCoR. So as we collectively implement a plan to address all of the reports and integrate the provisions from CHIPS and Science as well, our goal is to position our EPSCoR jurisdictions to be competitive, certainly both within our program, but in all of NSF for regional programs such as TIPS, regional innovation engines, but also center level programs in all of our NSF directorates, our early and mid-career programs, and even single investigator programs, again, across the agency. So in order to do this, there are 3 points that we are considering to drive our framing of next steps. So first, as the 2M report that has the ERIC model suggests, there is great variability across our jurisdictions. And as such, in our efforts to really build or expand opportunities for our jurisdictions, it's critical to consider challenges that may be associated with trying to use a one-size-fits-all model. And so in our efforts, we're really thinking hard about the jurisdictional variation that we see and an appropriate way to make sure that all jurisdictions have an opportunity to be engaged in NSF. Also, as EPSCoR program goals suggest, we are committed to extending impact to the entire research ecosystem and not just at the individual or the team level. So we have to invest in and support developments in, excuse me, multidimensional outcomes in a host of areas, again, including, the human capital development, the education development, the workforce development. And we also must use a more realistic timeline for measuring impact on the entire research ecosystem. Again, as the 2M study notes, measuring a jurisdiction's research competitiveness really takes 20 years or more. Excuse me. Also, I want to note that NSF EPSCoR funding, or really NSF funding in general, it's only a very small part of a jurisdiction's research excellence and competitiveness. There are a host of other investments at the jurisdiction level that are also relevant to consider and that heavily influence the sustainability, the speed, and the scale of research capacity building within our jurisdictions. So having shared that general context, I want to reiterate that we're really excited about shaping the future of EPSCoR. And this slide shares an abbreviated timeline for NSF's 2-year response, in particular to the Future of EPSCoR report. But these responses are also aligned with recommendations and findings in other reports that I've discussed, along with the provisions from CHIPS and Science. So in year 1, post-report release, and the 3 reports that I highlighted on the previous slide really were all released around the August-September 2022 timeline. Our activities for year 1 are chunked into 3 areas post-release of the report. So first, we're focusing on internal and external dissemination of the report and engagement with key stakeholders. Both Alicia and I have been given multiple platforms to discuss the report's recommendations and findings and engage our stakeholders within NSF, within the EPSCoR community. We've also been engaged with university and state leadership and in the broader science and research administration communities. So we are engaging with these groups really in hopes of building more effective partnerships for expanding and sustaining research competitiveness, and also conducting a more thorough assessment of infrastructure needs and data needs to support this effort. In fact, we just returned from Montana last week, where we met with various institutional leadership and EPSCoR stakeholders, and we have a few other visits planned to EPSCoR jurisdictions to do the same. Second, we are focusing on developing and enhancing an agency-wide plan for outreach to our EPSCoR jurisdictions. In the EPSCoR program, we certainly do this extensively, but we want to engage the rest of NSF as well in this work. And so this includes development of a comprehensive strategy for increasing our jurisdiction's participation in particular our NSF center level programs, including consideration of strategies to expand partnerships and entry points for jurisdictions into mainstream NSF funding. Of course, as a part of our agency priority goal and CHIPS and Science as well, we are also focused on increasing submission rates from our minority serving institutions and our ERIs. And from the data on the earlier slide, you saw that many of that involves institutions in EPSCoR jurisdictions. Third, we expect to be positioned to launch any new efforts by the end of year 1 through the beginning of year 2. And these efforts will use the 2M reports, academic research excellence and competitive model to really impact jurisdictional transformation, and will place more emphasis on transformation at the jurisdictional level and the entire research ecosystem. Any new EPSCoR activities and funding opportunities are expected to really put EPSCoR in a broader context so that metrics for jurisdictional success extend beyond just measuring, conducting research and publishing papers, but also to include sustainable research capacity that transforms the jurisdiction's research and innovation engine, and not just the individual or the institution. So I will pause here and thank you for your time and again, the opportunity, and I'll be happy to participate in the discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you. As you can tell, the Committee on Oversight, together with our friends like Matt Malkin, who I would like to have reflected in attendance, as well as Julia Phillips, have a whole lot of questions. Why don't we start off with Roger? You're our committee lead on EPSCoR. Would you like to start the questions?
Roger, you're on mute.
I thought I was Anila, I guess. I wonder if we want to handle the question from Julia first. That was in the chat box. I have a list of questions, and Sandra answered a number of them, and I want to follow up on several things. But we want to deal with Julia's question first.
Sure. That was about really impact. I'm pulling it up.
And that's right.
And I think that's true of the group. We really want to focus on what the impact of the outputs of EPSCoR are measured now, and propose changes for measurements. I mean, there's a lot of, conclusions and that sort of thing, but Julia likes data, as do we all. And I think that was what she was getting at. What do you think, Roger?
Yeah, I think that's the real question that we have. One of the things that Sandra mentioned and the report and diligent focuses on is outcomes, and one of them is the challenges with the different jurisdictional regions. And interestingly, on that map, there's sort of a lumping of these the boundaries sort of are in a band, right? If you can go north to south out of the central part of the US or across the south, these are challenges that are regional. They're not just in a certain jurisdiction. And the question is, how do we have to do more than just build a scientist's career or an institution's career. As you mentioned, Sandra, in your remarks at the end, we have to, our goal should be greater than that. And you noted that part. I have a couple of questions because in that report, in the report that was in the book, there's a couple of interesting diagrams that show the grouping of states and the impact of how these groups of states have failed in certain ways. And it makes note of the fact that we have a lot of federal investments in federal labs, but that alone is not enough to do it. You need at least one R1 kind of institution in the state to sort of stimulate the rest of that jurisdiction, which is underperforming. If you look at all of those data and then overlay TIP and the expectations of TIP for success, will require the involvement of those jurisdictional differences or changing jurisdictions. NSF's going to be judged on the success of TIP. So in large part, the success of EPSCoR will impact the success of TIP. And if those are not somehow co-planned, I don't see that in a decade we can bring about the changes that you anticipate, that we would like to have, and would like to see. So the consideration of jurisdictional responsibility and the co-jurisdictional responsibilities, how do we do this? And what you said at the very end was interesting to me also, because I hadn't heard it before. And that is the NSF is beginning to look at jurisdictional management. You implied that, but then in the visits that you had to Montana, I heard nobody. I didn't hear any indication that you had a legislative representative or the head of education in the state or economic development in the state represented at your meeting. So how do we engage the states to do their job better if they're not involved in our discussions? And then how do we get greater emphasis on cross-jurisdictional from non-EPSCoR and EPSCoR states to collaborate so there's a greater likelihood that a TIPS proposal will be successful and that TIPS in fact will be successful in renewing its budgets, because they're all webbed together. We really require EPSCoR engagement and jurisdictional engagement. But if we don't create EPSCoR or restructure EPSCoR in a way that will allow that to happen, then how do we achieve the goals of TIP? And then lastly, with all these recommendations, do we come into a clash with congressional mandates? Do we need an understanding of Congress to understand what we're doing, what our goals are, and what congressional goals are? So again, I'm looking at this bigger picture, and I love it. Any insights that you have that can help me feel like if we make what changes we do envision can be successful in jurisdictional impacts, especially in economics.
So thanks, Roger. I tried to take some copious notes, and we can certainly come back to anything that that I am not able to, that I didn't capture in my notes. And Alicia again's on the line. Alicia, please feel free to hop in at any time with any additional comments, and Jose the same, but I'll get us started. And one of the things that, it's always a challenge to fit everything you want to say in a 15-minute presentation, but I'll share just a slide just as for some additional context that I didn't share in the presentation, to Julia's point, and then to some of your points as well, Roger. But on the timeline slide that I did show, there were, several evaluations that were represented on that slide in terms of measuring impact. And so coupling all that together, this is EPSCoR's sort of abbreviated logic model in terms of outcome indicators, both and measuring the short-term, midterm, and long-term. And there are a number of metrics that we use at each of these periods on the time scale that aligns with the 5 goals that I talked about in the beginning of the presentation. And so I can come back and unpack this if that would be helpful, but I did want to share that. And to the point about
sorry, would you share that slide so that we can put it in our board book?
Sure.
Yes, I'd love to see that slide.
It's an excellent slide, and I think it goes directly to the kinds of questions we were asking.
Absolutely, would be happy to do that. And I can put it back up if that would be helpful later. And to Roger, to a few other points in terms of the federal investments and jurisdictional contributions. I mean, we're in line with that comment. We have been asking jurisdictions to do some self-assessments on their individual respective needs, and also to be reflective about, just to be blunt, about their skin in the game as well. So, what are jurisdictions bringing to the table when we talk about jurisdictional transformation, right? It's great to have our federal investments, and that's what we're here for. We're here to support our jurisdictions and make sure they're successful. But as I noted, we're only a very small part of a jurisdiction's success. And so jurisdictions themselves have to have some commitment beyond the traditional cost share commitment that we tend to see. And so that's a part of the conversations that we're having with jurisdictions. And you're spot on in noting, the types of people that we want to see involved in our conversations at the jurisdictional level. Montana was just one example, but when we put out our request to jurisdictions, we're asking for all the people that you named to be a part of the conversation. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but we want somebody in the economic development space. We want to talk to, superintendents of K-12 because that's an impact on the progress of the jurisdiction. And so they're very varied players other than just institutions who are involved. But again, we sometimes need to rely on the institutions and the jurisdiction to help us pull those people together for these meetings as we structure them. And we're working to get, the perfect model in place so that by the time we get to our 5th or 6th meeting, we'll have that. But we're early on in this process, just getting started. But I expect that those people that you mentioned to be certainly a part of conversations that we're having at the jurisdictional level. And in terms of the conflict with, with our congressional mandate, I don't foresee that being, any issue or challenge here. Our goal is to find the right mechanism to make sure that we're carrying out our mandated mission as a program and making sure that all institutions in a jurisdiction are being impacted positively and that the jurisdiction as a whole is able to see success in the research capacity space. And we want to be the vehicle or the mechanism to pull that together to make sure that happens.
Thank you very much. I've just a couple of comments, Scott, before it goes to you. Is there a way that, you've said the right things, and I'm glad you're listening to what the board said and to what the report said, because some of the features that you mentioned were in that NAS NRC report, of which I was a member of the committee. And so I have a long interest in this for a lot of reasons. And I'm glad to hear that these changes, that the studies are underway and that there's an agreement that we need to change. The question is, can you use an EPSCoR as a stick in any way to force some jurisdictional to encourage and urge legislative or jurisdictional change? That's a we have a $300 million stick, and we have more coming from TIP. So opportunities from TIP, and I think we can't be soft. We have to follow the mandate, but I wonder if there's not some way to get that jurisdictional representation and responsibility shared, not just the federal government share. That's what a lot of the NRC report was about. And thanks for listening to it. I've got more questions after it as well. So, but maybe they'll be offline if we run out of time.
Okay, Scott. Did we lose Scott?
Yeah, I think we lost him for a minute. Hopefully he'll log right back on.
Okay.
Well, can I continue with one more?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead, Roger.
In some of the tables that were in the diligent book, there it showed a disappointing trend in one of the tables of the downward trending of success rates of graduate students trained from 2017, I think, to 2021, maybe it was 2016. Can you help me understand how why they declined? Because we have a certain amount of money we should spend that we are mandated to spend. What were those trends caused by? Was there
I don't know if I know the answer to that. I can say overall at NSF, we saw some downward declines just in proposals in that time, in proposals and awards during that time period. And I would presume, without looking at the data right now in front of me, that impact was also felt in EPSCoR, in the EPSCoR program. But that's the same period. That's a downward trend throughout NSF.
I see. It was a little frightening, actually. And the trend up is not as rapid as a trend down from 17 down upward at the other end. So disappointing.
Scott, welcome back.
Thank you. My laptop died right on cue, but we're back. It sounds like Roger might have started touching on some of the things I was going to raise. Very interested in the impacts, particularly on the workforce and let's say the industrial capacity beyond all the regions and institutions and people that we touch, which the existing data does a great job of showing. But is that resulting in an increase in the number of STEM graduates or an increase in the success rate? Also interested beyond patents, the economic impact. Are there companies that are being started? Is there increased revenue going on? I realize that there is a definite time lag between the investment and the result, but we live in a political world, and these budgets are up for review in a matter of as often as annually. And if we're having an impact, I think we need to show that just as quickly as we can. So as an addition, I think we have to start talking about more specific impacts that we're having, at least in some areas that maybe are stellar and the like. Or look, we made this investment. Not only did we fund this many graduate students, but they've stayed here. They were, developed in these institutions. We've established a broader workforce and had an economic impact in that area, aside from just we spent money here.
So Stephen Bullard, if I may,
Please.
Okay. So I'll share another slide that may be a good way to at least begin a response to this question here. So on our visit last week to Montana, we had some great conversations around the economic development piece and the result of EPSCoR funding in Montana. And so from a very early EPSCoR award, really from 92, 93, we've seen result from that, the creation of the Optical Technology Center at Montana State University, which promotes optics and photonics research and education for economic development in the state of Montana. And this is so critical because the optics and photonics team shared that without the EPSCoR work, where they are today just would not have been possible. That as a result of that initial EPSCoR award, 40 optics and photonics companies in Montana have been created that have employed over 1,000 people in high-tech jobs. Many of those companies are still in existence, or some have been bought by larger companies. They now have a graduate degree pipeline that's feeding their graduate students from Montana State to these companies that are located throughout the state of Montana. They've been able to hire several faculty, tenure track faculty in particular. The grant supported an initial 4, and that is now at a 16 level number for tenure track faculty. They have been very successful in obtaining other grants, both in the federal space and in the private space, to ensure the sustainability of research that's coming from this initial work. And that's just one example because we just visited Montana, but we could probably go through lots of our other jurisdictions and show similar types of examples of how the EPSCoR initial funding has been leveraged to see these kinds of outcomes. Scott, I appreciate the question because I know that means we have to do a better job in communicating that and in making sure that others are aware of this type of really jurisdictional transformation in terms of jobs created, companies created, graduates produced across all of our jurisdictions.
Yeah, that's a great example, and it takes care of a lot of what I brought up. Bringing that across at a program level would be spectacular.
I can't agree more, Scott. I wonder, Sandra, if how many examples are like that across the jurisdictions, and whether or not there are other ways to show it, or is there a way that Montana can let other states know what they had to do to accomplish it? and have it be a teaching opportunity for them to share with other states. Montana doesn't strike me as one of those that's the poorest states in the union either, because of their other industries. But I wonder about other institutions, other states in the Midwest, for example, Iowa, which has a really great economic engine in agriculture, but has not developed and has worked and committed their own resources to economic development. And I wonder about a state like that, why it's not graduated yet. Is it Iowa or Nebraska? Sorry, I can't recall here. The other question I have, that's the second one. Sorry, I always ask multiple questions. Sorry, Sandra, but the other one is, so how does EPSCoR interact with other programs within the agency, such as the granted program or others, to leverage or to sort of leapfrog one off the other so that everybody is successful, that every program which encourages diversity and so forth is successful? How does that work inside?
Yeah, so I'll say that traditionally, our co-funding mechanism has really been the primary means of interacting with directorates at NSF in terms of funding additional work from our EPSCoR PIs. Moving forward, we are looking for new opportunities to certainly engage with our directorates and our internal colleagues, and there are lots of potential opportunities in overlap in goals of programs, in opportunities for partnering with EPSCoR jurisdictions and non-EPSCoR jurisdictions, regional efforts that are ongoing. And so that is all a part of this early work that we're doing in response to the Future of EPSCoR report as an agency, really looking at ways to partner with EPSCoR across the agency beyond just the co-funding mechanism.
Good. I think that can be extended to TIP, because TIP has such a responsibility, and there are other parts inside it's not how do you make EPSCoR more successful, it's how do we make the mission of geographic and other diversity accomplishing other diversity measurements through our efforts as a whole, sort of NSF as one, not as the directorates or programs, right? That's part of the reason for that question.
Absolutely.
And I can't remember my first question, but it was also there. Did you make a note of the first question I asked?
There are other there are other agencies that are involved in EPSCoR. Going to Roger's point about creating an integrated whole, do we interact with the other agencies and create somewhat of a unified approach?
That was one of the questions, right? NIH and USDA and others.
Yeah.
Do what we do in NSF impact other agencies, or how do we homogenize together our regional efforts?
Sure. Jose, I see your hand. Do you mind if I take this question and then, or do you want to interject?
No, I just wanted to make a comment about a question that Roger asked. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'll answer this and then, so yes, absolutely. We NSF, EPSCoR, we engage with our other federal partners with EPSCoR and EPSCoR-like programs. So NIH, Department of Energy, USDA, DOD. In fact, we have an EPSCoR interagency coordinating committee where all the heads of the federal EPSCoR and EPSCoR-like programs sit on this committee, and I'm the chair of that committee. So we meet 3 times a year, and a big part of we have strategic goals, but a big part of our work is really looking at ways that we can collaborate or leverage our individual efforts to really make a larger impact in our EPSCoR jurisdictions. A few of the agencies use this NSF's definition for eligibility in their own programs eligibility, and other agencies have another set of eligibility criteria based on the mission of their respective agency. All of us have different missions, and so to some extent, our focus is different. but we do find ways to collaborate. As an example, EPSCoR NSF has a collaborative partnership with NASA EPSCoR as a part of our Track 4 effort in our EPSCoR program. And NASA is very engaged with us in outreach efforts and identifying fellows. And we just released a new solicitation with some changes to include both early career faculty and mid-career faculty in EPSCoR jurisdictions. And I think
Thank you, Jose.
Yes, I just wanted to make a brief comment about the question that Roger asked about the boundaries of the EPSCoR jurisdictions. We actually address that issue in the reports, and I want to remind you that one key recommendation that we actually provided is to ensure that institutions from both EPSCoR and non-EPSCoR jurisdictions can form partnerships. And I think that's something that is needed. The second idea I want to share with you is that these leaders of the subcommittee plus the leaders from the EPSCoR program at NSF met with staffers from Congress, from both houses, and they were really very, very enthusiastic about the recommendations. And the last idea is that you as a National Science Board need to keep in mind that NSF has $250 million to dispense here. We really need to make investments in the EPSCoR jurisdictions, because that's where we have roughly 25% of the population, and that's where we have many of our minority serving institutions. So we need to keep that idea in mind.
Yeah, I don't think the question is, do we need to do it? The question is, how do we ensure the greatest success or best outcomes for that amount for that investment, which we do make. That's why it's getting the scrutiny that it deserves.
Yeah.
I don't mean to rush off here, but I have another meeting on this at the half hour.
We're at the bottom of the hour. Are there any other last questions or whatever? I think this has been a tremendous discussion. Jose, thank you very much, and I appreciate all your CIAS work. Sandra, in my opinion,
Sandra, both of you.
Sandra, you knocked it out of the park. When you get into the details, I mean, that slide about measurable goals in your 5 areas, that slide on Montana, that's exactly the kind of impact measuring. And the more we hear about that, not only does it motivate and excite us, but it will motivate and excite other people. So I really thank everyone for participating in this meeting. Our committee members, our members of the board who expressed their interest and attendance on meetings of great importance like this. And we look forward to the next one. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.